Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Dr. Georgia Lindsay, Senior Lecturer in Architecture and Design at the University of Tasmania. I want to begin by recognizing the deep history and culture of this island. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, of the land upon which this campus of the University of Tasmania was built. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status, and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. Today, I'm delighted to host the second of 3 panels celebrating the publishing of contemporary museum architecture and design, theory and practice of place, where today, 2 of the authors who contributed chapters will overview their work and take questions. And I'm just going to pop in here in the chat box the YouTube link for the previous panel in case anyone is interested. So this book that we're talking about today sprang from work I was doing on a previous book. Right after I finished my PhD, I wrote a book on the user perspective on contemporary art museum architecture, using 14 case studies to identify 7 different user types. And as I interviewed architects and museum administrators about the buildings they had designed, proposed, inhabited, I was awed by how transformative some of these designs were. It was architecture for a fundamentally different conceptualization of what museums could do and what museums could offer to communities. And I really wanted to highlight that by bringing together authors from architecture practice, from museum administration, and from academia, so that their work could be in conversation and these ideas that I had gotten to hear as I was interviewing could sort of be made a little bit more public. So our 2 authors presenting today are both architects designing museums and galleries, among many, many other things that they're working on. And in their chapters, they present a radical rethinking about how architecture can inspire curiosity and community and really serve people in a different way, perhaps, than galleries and museums have done in the past. So you can read their chapters along with 16 other excellent chapters at the library. Hopefully your local library has it. If not, if you want to own the book, you can get a 20% discount with the code that I just popped in the chat. So the way this is going to work is that I will introduce each of the 2 speakers, and then they will give a presentation. If there are any quick questions as we're going along, you can pop them in the Q&A box, everyone, and we can answer those immediately, but there will be a longer question and answer period, a longer block of time for question and answers after both of them have presented. So as I said, during or after the presentation, attendees, you're welcome to pop any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then if you have any comments, you can put that in the chat box if you like. So I will monitor them both and try to manage them. So first we have Kirsten Thompson, who is a principal of KTA and an adjunct professor at RMIT and Monash Universities. She regularly lectures and contributes to Studio Crits at the University of Melbourne and Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. In recognition for the work of her practice, contribution to the profession and its education, she was elevated to Life Fellow by the Australian Institute of Architects in 2017. She plays an active role in promoting quality design within the profession and the wider community through her position as a panel member on the Office of the Victorian Government Architects Design Review Panel and board member for Melbourne Housing Expo, a research group led by the University of Melbourne. And you can find her practice here. I put a link in the chat box. Take it away.
Thank you, Georgia. It's a pleasure to speak tonight and to meet William through this strange means. It's really a really fascinating book and a topic or interest dear to our hearts from here. We've I'll just share my screen, things you forget to do in these new world. So So what we wanted to focus on tonight was really how museum architecture is more and more a blueprint for forming place. And it's not just about inviting congregation for the purpose of museum going, it's also a way to extend, if you like, beyond the walls of its official domain and weaving it into the life of the community. So we're interested in the ways in which museums and galleries might become a little more incidental to everyday experience and enjoyment of place. And in fact, tell us something about where we are in the world as well. So a sort of localizing force. So I'm going to talk through 4 projects, one built, 2 under construction, and another one that sadly a competition that we didn't quite win. But nevertheless, some interesting ideas about this intention of museum as placemaker. So some of these thoughts have been influenced by the words of Elaine Guerin and her thinking that the museum as a placemaker could be considered as a new town square, a way to, and so I want to talk through some of the sort of design approaches and spatial devices in this formation of place that can strengthen community and reinforce the museum's performance as that. So to think of the museum as a place for gathering and community, a place where connections are forged, where skills are acquired, and a love of art or history nurtured, culture celebrated. So the sort of various things that museums do. And the ways in which it embraces its traditional role, but also exceeds it with wide-ranging initiatives that include research, education programs, artist in residence programs, and of course the sort of commercial programs or purposes like retail, beverage, and so forth. But if they're sort of programming initiatives, really what I will focus on are the spatial devices to reinforce this part of museum as, if you like, new town square or placemaker. And also in ways in which we can make museums more inclusive and more welcoming to more people. Elaine Guerin talks about this idea of threshold fear. So what are the means by which design, apart from operational things, might help more people feel like they can comfortably access the space of the museum? So to start, this is Monash University Museum of Art from some time ago. And this is an example of where the introduction of the museum into the Caulfield campus was a means by which we could start to undertake some urban and campus repair. You can see here what we started with. It's on a highway, it's that curved building there. And when we started with the site, it was the space around it was used for dumpsters and car parks. So this is its transformation later. It's a classic case of where the official brief was to do an interior museum. And in fact, we piggybacked the renewal of that whole surrounding space as well and turned it into the Ian Potter Sculpture Forecourt. So that's about sort of leveraging one part of program to create a new opportunity, which really transformed the campus. And that's where I think that kind of campus-wide or city-wide thinking around museums is really important. They're not just insular facilities in and of themselves. They can have this broader impact when we extend the context. So here, sort of an early sketch about the campus-wide thinking of this potential forest into that external space. And then the plan there with the yellow, which just describes how the interior program and those gallery spaces are imagined as being brought out into the landscape so that the experience of art becomes incidental to people's everyday life. So here, Callum Morton's silver screen, which is how the museum presents itself on the highway. And I love that someone who might never actually go to Mooma will drive past it every night, and inevitably it becomes part of their landscape or daily commute. Then from within the campus itself, the presence that it has as landscape, and then the big canopy, which set up valuable connections across other parts of the university and provides glimpses in this aspect of the renewal that the landscape introduces within and surrounding it. And then from inside the gallery, these long views out to that garden. So that integration of inside and outside experience of the museum, which is sort of central to that intention to bring museum program out into the broader public realm, or in this instance, into the campus. And this favourite view of what the experience is inside to outside. With some similar initiatives, the Jewish Holocaust Centre, which is currently under construction, started with what you can see here, 2 buildings on its site. This earlier building here, which was the first one obtained by the Jewish community with the beginnings of the Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, and then a later addition by SJB, which you can see on the right-hand side. Excuse me. What was interesting for us here was how we might incorporate, almost as one of the key cultural artifacts, that original building into the new development. And I should say too, this is not just a museum, it also has an education program as well as research. And so we wanted to give equal priority in the way in which the building is arranged to those 3 aspects of the program, because of course, looking forward and educating is such a fundamental part of this centre, in addition to looking back and understanding events that have happened and shaped the way of the world. So in this, we imagined embedding the original corner facade within this new building fabric, and then thinking about a sort of new relationship between the interior of the Holocaust Museum and its street. One of the things that we have found in our looking at other Holocaust museums is they do tend to adopt one of 2 strategies, sometimes to kind of imitate, if you like, some of the most horrendous trauma sites, and alternatively to present as a kind of bunker, quite a defensive type of architecture. Here we could see how this building is very integral to the Jewish community in a number of their other buildings and facilities in Melbourne, and in line with council policy as well, to make it a very important part of this precinct. So it was, how might we open up the museum or the centre to the neighbourhood? And so simple things like making an entry sequence that feels more welcoming, more transparent, and even little things like incorporating the old arch into the research centre here, so that when you first walk in, that research activity is something you can see into. Typically, again, glass is something that is feared because of the sort of security issues. So it was trying to overcome that through the architecture, and then using its heritage parts to be integral to that new experience. Another thing too is about reinforcing through the museum and its architecture that you are here in Melbourne, you're not elsewhere, as a way to bring people back to where they are right now in their experience or understanding of these events from the past. So things like skylights, and then the use of mirrors and other elements are ways that while you're deep within the museum, you are brought back to your current location. Which we can see here. So reflection is quite an important device within that. One of the ways in which we thought about resisting this idea of the bunker, which you can see was an inevitable byproduct perhaps of things like the Kristallnacht and what that meant in terms of the smashing of windows and the sorts of connotations with glass. Here in this instance, we thought, what does it mean to be in Melbourne, where it is relatively safe to be able to be culturally identified and present? And so this use of glass bricks in the facade was a way to rethink transparency, to show the life within the building rather than to suppress that, and to really celebrate this as a building that looks forward, and the treatment of its facade manages its transparency depending on what happens behind it, and to show off the garden and people behind. So to life. The third project is the Shepparton Art Museum, which is the competition entry from a few years back. And with this project, we saw this as a way to really engage with the ecology of the situation it was within. It was part of the site was part of the Goulburn Valley River system, which you can see that sort of extended appreciation of site. And what that means as a very dynamic type of landscape, as for those of you who are not in Australia, perhaps from the media over the last year, you might be aware that it is a place of dramatic climatic contrasts. So we seem to pitch all of our sites between fire and flood threats. So in this instance, we thought, what does it mean to build within one of these flood landscapes where really sites don't have boundaries as such? When it comes to water, floodwaters don't respect a property boundary. So we were interested in thinking instead of a building as a point of resistance, rather thinking of the building as something that just works effortlessly with those dynamic circumstances. The other thing is, being in the flood zone, the brief required for it to be elevated, largely elevated above ground to let the waters pass underneath. And so we thought about, instead of stacking the program over 4 levels, instead kind of smearing it out as a canopy of sorts above the ground, and then taking out a series of bites from its building envelope to set up a series of territories around its perimeter. And that's where, for the purpose of tonight, I'm less interested in what it means for an interior for a museum, and rather how the building of the museum in a public park can actually make for a better park setting and a series of different kinds of occupiable or place-making devices around it, hence the bites out of that, which also internally form these view corridors, and these feet, the round feet, which allow for water to pass through in flood. So in simple terms, having a more ecological approach, if you like, to how the building is sited and works with the systems of that extended river landscape. And then this other imperative that the museum is something that anyone can walk through day and night, as I touched on with Monash, where people can walk past and just catch a glimpse of something. Here we imagined it as a kind of armature for every day, where people can pass through it on their dog walks or their jog and so on. So it becomes very integral, and you start to break down some of those barriers between the sort of formal museum and its everyday life and contribution to our day-to-day habits, if you like. So just to finish on this one, I also like how here you get a sense of it in the sort of day-to-day dry times, and then what it means when you're presented as flood, and how the design anticipates that dynamic landscape and in fact celebrates it through the architecture as a way to talk about place. To finish, I'll take you through Riversdale Creative Learning Centre, Gallery and Accommodation. This is for the Bundanon Trust up in New South Wales. And I think one of the most fascinating parts of this project is because it's the trust that was started by Arthur and Yvonne Boyd. And Arthur Boyd, a very renowned Australian painter, especially of landscapes. And so part of this is to do a gallery, and what's fascinating to us, and this beautiful painting of Boyd's really encapsulates, is what it means to develop a building or a series of buildings that put you in the landscape that is actually the subject of his paintings that you can also at the same time see. So you're able to compare the thing outside the window, for instance, or through the frame, and the rendition of that, his imaginary landscape. So similarly, some of the things that Boyd was intrigued by and which are captured in his paintings is this tension between, say, the exotic landscape, hence the rose, and then the indigenous landscape, or between the forest, which is in the black on the right-hand side, and then these clearings where farming and other sort of practices have happened in the settling of this landscape, which you can see on the right. So these were some of the ingredients for our approach. We were very interested in how the design of the gallery and the accommodation and the learning centre might be used as a device for setting up even and framing some of these key descriptions or representations of landscape of Boyd. So it's a site with intense cultural, ecological and architectural heritage. And it's within the Shoalhaven landscape, which has these sorts of rocky escarpments, these sort of wet and dry gullies, these sort of rolling hills. So as a broader intent that we brought to the site, we were keen to provide an array of very different experiences of that place, from being sort of embedded in the landscape or sort of buried within it, through to straddling over and bridging these gully landscapes. And that aligned very nicely with the climatic imperatives for the project, where the gallery space would require, you know, more conditioning and certainly more passive control by being embedded, for instance, through to the other end of the spectrum where you're fully exposed to the changing temperature and climate. If it's a hot day, you feel the heat and so forth. So that diagram gave us a way to organise our program according to those different treatments. So in a nutshell, we have the Beck Merkert Lewin Light building here, a cluster of heritage buildings that were there from the Boyd's occupation, including Boyd's studio, and then the new gallery, which is under the hill that's existing, and this new bridge element for the visitor facilities, as well as a little pedestrian bridge. Some early models describing this embedded and then elevated elements, the bridge structure, which really celebrates that gully landscape and was inspired by some of the sorts of flood bridges that you find throughout our various flood landscapes, as also an interesting datum that really sort of highlights the undulations of the ground. So a little bit similar to Sam, where we were also interested in how the buildings and the design of the landscape and the engineering of it are all fully integrated into, if you like, a more ecological or systems-based appreciation of place, rather than simply a picturesque one. So not just what things look like, but also how do they perform? How does the hydrology of this site allow the extended site and the whole sort of Shoalhaven network to remain unimpeded, and hence the sort of dry to wet landscapes, as I saw it last week. Actually, there's quite a lot of rain. So on the bridge, you have, in the spirit of Boyd's painting, he often painted en plein air, you know, out in the field. And so we like the way when future occupants are in these spaces on the bridge, they are similarly in that landscape and in that climate and exposed to its changes. And then as we sort of move into the gallery space, that is obviously a much more thermally stable space within the hill that's there too. And here you get a hint of being in the gallery space, looking at a Boyd painting, and then also through that skylight being able to get a glimpse of that same landscape. So this kind of comparison between the actual and the imaginary landscapes. And then just by way of sort of finishing up, the other thing we're finding more and more, and this is an example of that in some other projects we're working on at the moment, is just this whole evolution of back and front of house, which we're seeing in a lot of gallery and museum design, which I think is a further means by which galleries or museums are rethinking that line between, you know, what is allowed to be seen by visitors and what's kept behind the scenes or they're not exposed to. And so this idea of the open collection store is one of the other ways in which sort of current museum design is changing that relationship between visitor and works, and the production of works as well, storage becoming a way of also experiencing it for visitors. So to finish up, I'm just ending on, it's not really technically a gallery or museum as such, but this is a community gallery that's part of the Broadmeadows Town Hall that we finished about a year ago. And I think what's interesting here is how the, and has really been emphasised actually through COVID, is just how important these sorts of cultural and museum spaces are to the life of communities, and as places to sort of hold stories, tell the stories of the community, and to think through, in this instance, ways to make them very accessible spaces. This one has a big tilt door that opens up to the north, to the square out there. So it's really about making it a much more accessible space and more inclusive space that overcomes that that notion of threshold fear, so that the place of the museum is something for everybody. And in many ways is a bit of a counter to the sort of merely iconic forms that we sometimes associate with the significance, if you like, of museum and gallery buildings, into something that expands its vision and is very much about an everyday enjoyment and appreciation of place and way of connecting citizens with each other and with the ideas that we need to exist as enriched communities. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I didn't see any questions, sort of short questions come through, so I think we will barge ahead and have a longer time for questions later. So fabulous, thank you. So William Smart is the founder and creative director of sorry, I'm making sure my computer's doing something. William Smart is the founder and creative director of Smart Design Studio. Directly involved in every project, his buildings have received critical acclaim, won prestigious awards, and have been widely published in architectural and other publications. William initially worked for Gersau Architecture in France, followed by Foster and Partners in London, where he contributed to various award-winning projects. In 20 years of directing his own multidisciplinary practice, his enthusiasm and passionate attention to detail is fundamental to the studio's success, motivating a highly dedicated team of architects and interior designers to realize projects of the highest quality and innovation. And in case anyone is interested, here is a link to Smart Design Studio. William.
Thank you, Georgia. It's a great privilege to be here, and I thoroughly enjoyed Kirsten's talk. Thank you for that. Many of the themes are things that I'd like to talk about as well. So openness, transparency, engagement, and I think probably if there's a difference, our presentation will skew slightly more towards the internal machinations of a gallery or museum. I might share my screen with a little bit of help and then start a bit of a presentation. Just like to begin by thanking all of our team at STS for the work that they do and the people that have helped me put the talk together tonight. Georgia Lindsay for including me in this book and the discussion about contemporary museums. I'd like to say that I'm deeply interested in museums. I love visiting them all around the world. And personally, I like the ones that combine great architecture and art. Not just because I'm an architect, but because I believe that architectural experiences can really elevate us, like the feeling I get when I walk in the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern, or the feeling I get when I walk through Paris and stumble across the square in front of the Pompidou, or the feeling I get when I walk down the spiral stair at the Guggenheim in New York. However, I have come to believe that the transformation of galleries is required, and I feel like the design and the architecture is really letting them down. Change pages here. Sorry. And then go down. So really, I want to talk tonight in about 5 chapters and start with our work on the White Rabbit Gallery in Sydney, and then talk about this chapter I've contributed to the book, which is about the Open and Connected Museum, and then lightly touch on the Science Gallery in Melbourne, which is about to open, our new office, Stokes 14, and how that works as a place that talks about how we make architecture, and finally, Indigo Slam as the House Museum. Beginning with White Box Gallery, which is the White Rabbit Gallery, which is the White Box Gallery. The gallery exists over 4 floors of exhibition space and is located in Chippendale, at the emerging new centre of Sydney. And from the outside, you see it through the back streets of Chippendale, almost as if it were a fairly typical warehouse building. But when looking a bit closer, you can see that the windows are in fact light boxes to bring light into the space, and there's a confident floating roof over the building. And this sets it apart from apartment or office buildings, in conjunction especially with the transparent glass at ground floor. Now, this project was finished about 10 years ago, and we use these fluorescent light tubes as light shading devices to bring beautiful white light into the space, as you can see in the foyers through here, and with a different quality of light at dusk into the tea room at the front of the gallery through here again. And I mentioned before that we have clear glass that is not protected through security bars, but is open to allow visitors to see into the gallery out of hours and over the weekends. And they can look into this beautiful stair hall as if it were a kind of exhibition space, therefore invigorating the streetscape and allowing people to see a space which is where light and architecture become as one, and the exhibition changes with a real focus on the art, and the stair meanders up through the space, allowing art to be seen from many levels. And in this white box gallery, the real focus is to take the person into a transformed world where the huge range of artworks from the White Rabbit collection can be displayed in a dark space, for example, or in a transformed, colourful space, or in an immersive experience where you feel like you've left the world. And sometimes they're places where the architecture is very present, but can be blocked out. And sometimes they're simply a stage for the art. But it's this white box gallery that is the most simple and flexible and capable of transformation. Now, because of my ongoing relationship with the gallery and with Judith, I get to see all of the installations that happen within the exhibition spaces, and I find them very interesting to see and very exciting, and I wanted to talk a bit about that. So the next part I'd like to talk about is this idea of the open and connected gallery. And I'm really interested in the future of museums as the cultural cornerstones for our communities and how the architecture can support them, particularly on the themes of openness, transparency, and engagement with the community. So I sort of started this project quite by accident, but I was frustrated and I developed a position of what I thought galleries might look like in the future. And then without really planning it, I called a couple of directors and asked them if I could interview them, and they said yes. And then eventually this evolved to interviewing about 20 directors, curators, and museum specialists from around Australia and also from around the world to explore a set of themes. The themes were the gallery, and to talk about that as a unique spatial experience or as a white box. To talk about the concepts of openness, and by that I mean the transparency and some of the things that Kirsten's talked about, accessing the things that are normally hidden. I wanted to talk about exposing the content as well as the process. So in that scenario, the content is the things you exhibit and the process is the way you make them or present them or bring them to life. I wanted to talk about refitting the galleries and whether that's something good to see or not see and what the challenges are through there. I was interested in open storage facilities, noting that most galleries only exhibit less than 10% of their collections. And I wanted to talk about education as well as community and gathering, and also the financial underpinnings of these galleries. And this really started at the Prada Foundation in Milan, where I went to visit the building as much as the exhibition, only to find that this main hall on the right was closed. And that's probably the thing I really wanted to see most. And so prying open the doors and just peeking through the cracks that were there, I was berated by a security guard and told to not do that, and felt like I'd come all this way to want to sense the space, to smell it, to feel it, to see it, and I couldn't do that. On the same trip, the same kind of experience happened at the Maxi in Rome, and I realized that most of the times I go and see galleries, there's a significant portion of it that's closed, and that frustrated me. So that was one part of it. I also note that most museums only show a small fraction of their collection, and they rarely reveal their operations. I was also just, do you want to close that door? Sorry, there's a dog barking. I was also sort of interested in what that might be like. What would it be like to see into the back of house in uncurated areas and unrehearsed activity, and how people might feel about that. And the kinds of things I was talking about was conservation. It's really interesting to see, however, it's slow and laborious, and how can architecture allow this to happen and to work very well. And it sort of really was cemented by a conversation I had with Nick Mitzvich, who's the director of the National Gallery. And he claimed that the Pompidou Centre's design in the 1970s expressed the building's mechanics to really show that art galleries were far from passive buildings. And that in the 21st century, we were really calling for another kind of openness, really. And rather than revealing the building structure and its services, this new openness would really show the operations of the institutions as a kind of theatre that would enrich the visitors' experiences, to give the audience more of an understanding of the processes behind the institution. So I asked people what would happen if you could see into the galleries during installation. What would it be like? And people were concerned with security risks. They were worried about seeing how, for example, the valuable artworks might be secured to the wall. They're worried that visitors might enter into hazardous work zones. They're worried about accidental damage to artworks being caught on film. And more than anything, they're worried that it might just be a bit boring. So I started to think that combined with how you might look on these back of house areas could be perhaps solved with an architectural solution. And the thing that came to my mind was a mezzanine overlooking vast areas. So if you had a beautiful space and an installation was happening on several areas within that, if you're elevated looking down over that, could be a really interesting thing to experience. And how could you build on that to form a new type of experience in a gallery? And I agreed with Serge Bellet from the National Gallery of Canada, who really was honing in on this idea that over the past 20 years, libraries have really reinvigorated themselves as public and neighbourhood centres. When 20 years ago, when the internet was sort of emerging as a new new medium, people were all saying the books were dead, they weren't going to be around anymore. And I feel this is really driven home to me personally at the end of this COVID lockdown period, where I've had enough of Teams and Zoom meetings in many ways, and just crave to go to a theatre and crave to go to venues where smell, sound, light, atmosphere can be felt in tangible ways. And I'm kind of curious about how you bring some of this life to galleries and museums. A great example of that is in Massachusetts. The MoCA there, Museum of Contemporary Art, is as much a community centre as it is an art gallery. And this kind of connects to a conversation I had with Tony Elwood from the NGV, who remarked that 2 days after the 9/11 tragedy, they had a sharp increase in the number of visitors. People saw that building as a safe place where they could revisit old memories and feel comfortable again. Now, that's not necessarily what you would do online. And then also what I hadn't really looked at the start of this project, but became very evident along the way, was that funding galleries is expensive and always at the forefront of people's minds. And some people, such as Chris Sains from the Queensland Art Gallery, felt that the public nature of the gallery needed to be preserved. So if you have ways of collecting revenue from ticket sales or a bookstore, for example, that needed to be very secondary. So the message of it being a state institution was very clear. Now, other art galleries like the MCA in Sydney are privately funded. So the MCA, for example, collects about 1/3 of its revenue from its function rooms and venues. And so that has a meaningful influence on the design of the gallery. How do you service it? How do you provide security to the gallery where the security of the art is paramount? And then the MoMA shop in New York is a destination in itself. I mean, I would go there just to find something to buy that I hadn't thought of. And I can't think of many museums in Australia where I would do that. Now, education is also a crucial part of galleries in their operation. And I see these kind of centres of excellence being really developed. I also think that you could start to link that back to commercial revenues and the openness and community mindedness that I'm talking about. So if you were to have an auditorium in a gallery, that may be open, if it were designed in the right way, to show art house films or talks or education programs or digital screenings that were out of hours. But it needs to have independent access, because opening up the gallery to show a film is cost prohibitive due to security restraints and restrictions. And then I really was talking to people about the landmark gallery versus the white box gallery. So the Guggenheim in New York is your classic landmark gallery. It's recognizable from the outside, it's recognizable from the inside, and it has restrictions on how it's used as well. These are roughly characterized by the landmark building is designed specific to its place. It would often have expressive circulation of materials and spatial dynamics, while the white box functionalist museum is characterized by something that is much more focused on the internal galleries themselves that may not necessarily interact with the world outside of them. And a great example of the white box gallery is Sydney's MCA, which I touched on before. And Lisanne McGregor's vision for the extension to the building was a place where the artist is the hero. And she also recognises that the cost of fitting the galleries in these kinds of spaces is much less, where the galleries themselves are art ready in that scenario. And Michael Brand, the director of the New South Wales Art Gallery, sees the heroic architecture of the 90s as being replaced by something that is more restrained, more porous, and more integrated. And you can see sort of parts of that here, I believe, in the White Rabbit, where the gallery is open to the street, and that level of transparency on the ground floor is really quite unusual. So united amongst all those thoughts really are this kind of idea that the galleries probably are influenced more than anything by their purpose, so what they're there for, and the kinds of arts that they're going to exhibit. And I think the Bilbao is kind of held up as a great example of revitalising tourism to the town, and that is a core part of its purpose. It is there to bring people to that city, which may not be right for every project. So the work I was sort of really focusing on was trying to sort of position galleries as more of a cultural hub. So not necessarily about exhibiting art, but developing a cultural place where I think people talk about them as the kind of cathedrals of our time. And by that, I feel as though it's the place where you go and feel and gather and sense and reflect and do the things that people might have done in religious institutions in the past. And the benefits of that is that you start to build this creative community at a place that's vibrant and sustainable and is focused on creativity as much as the art themselves. So that was the kind of rough thinking about what I was working on for the book. And I'll just sort of talk about this idea of transparency with the Science Gallery in Melbourne, which is in its final stages of construction now. We had our first site visit this week to check on defects. But the gallery is really a space that works at the intersection of art and science. For example, an exhibition here is shown about the art and science of perfection, or about the art and science of blood. And it's located on the corner of Grattan and Swanston Streets in Melbourne. And it's at the base of a new building designed by Woods Bagot. And in this building, we have a basement area which has workshops and a black box theatre. And above that, we have a 100-metre long exhibition space. And that is contained beneath a roof, which is made of, or a ceiling, which is made of grid of sliding tracks, so that we can support modular components that would allow the gallery's installations to be agile and therefore viewed by people coming through the space, and to really start to reduce some of the waste on the project, noting that a lot of an exhibition goes in a skip bin. So all of those panels are suspended from a gridded system like this, and that is distorted around the cores of the existing building. And we were really thinking about an expression of science, in this case, fluid dynamics, that would start to connect the purpose of the gallery back to its architectural form, in the space that has the feeling of undulating surfaces that are in fact horizontal but don't appear that way, that wrap around the existing cores of the building. And we were really designing the gallery as much as a hangout space as it was a place for exhibiting art. And that really took the form of a very transparent space that's very open to the streets. It's one where all the floors are, for example, galvanized metal and raw, as are the concrete surfaces, so that it starts to connect with a more youth audience, but we can also adhere surfaces to it using magnets, so that the timber flooring could be magnetically applied and therefore recycled. And we really tried to build this space which is very flexible and agile, but could also create that immersive experience that you want in a gallery. And then the ambiguous spaces take the form of things like bleachers, taking you down to a lower level where there's a black box auditorium, or workshop spaces that are connecting back to education programs. So this kind of idea of the gallery and education and hangout space is all merging in together as one. And even up to the street, with windows to the street, there's a PC1 rated lab where an artist in residence could make an artwork that might be experimental in its nature. So this is kind of an idea about transparency in how people can see the refitting, the changing, the developing world of this museum space. And it's not necessarily a static gallery that's opened up for the grand reveal opening day. I also just wanted to talk a bit about process and content and what that meant for us. But this is the idea of showing how you make the work as well as what you show. And in doing these interviews, I was often walked through offices and studio spaces, only to see these kind of beautiful models of exhibitions that are about to happen. Amazing sort of work pinned up on the wall and hundreds of people working behind the scenes. And it just blew my mind how many people work in these institutions, and yet it's very visible. So if you go to a gallery, normally you arrive at the entry, there's a code check, and then you get a ticket and you go on the exhibition. But there's so much that's behind the scenes that I think is quite fascinating. And in a world today where we love seeing those behind the scenes actions, I was very curious about how much of that we could expose. So I really wanted to use our office to talk a bit about this, and we tried to design our office as an exhibition space, but also as a place where we show our process. And it's located in Alexandria, which is halfway between Sydney CBD and the airport. And it's in an area which is surrounded by these old, used but unrenovated warehouses, and we love them. And this is the one that we bought, and it looked like this on the inside. It's in a factory that made lolly machines. And the building was largely restored, and then we rebuilt the front 7 meters that had been almost destroyed at the start of the project. And across the top, we built these brick vaulted roof. From the outside, the building looks a bit like this. So it's quite open in parts to the street, but also closed. So it kind of has an open and closed nature. And the apartment is located across the top floor behind the vaulted roof shown there. Inside our foyer space is a place where you come straight into a place where you can see into the studio, the little dog there at the top of the stairs, and you can also see kind of beautiful images of our work. I mean, we wanted to show our work as pieces of art in a way. And then in the studio space, you can look across the whole area, a little bit like the mezzanines I was talking about in this idea I had for just engaging with the whole of the space, but not necessarily feeling like you're invading someone's personal territory. And then through the space, you can see we pin up our work on the walls, and there's tons of models that are lying around, like literally hundreds. And then at the ends of each of the bays, we have these display cases where we show the significant projects of ours from the last 20 years. And so what you're seeing in the space is the process. You're seeing the work being created, pinned up on the walls. You're also seeing the work being exhibited. And it has a great energy to that, because people can come into the studio and feel the vibe and feel the work's being made, but they also see the content of our last 20 years on exhibition. And the materials library is shown through here. And then items like the staircase up to the top floor are opportunities to be expressive for us in the works we like to create. And everything is on show. So the cafe at the back is like this. And there's another form of kind of exhibition on the top floor. We have a beautiful apartment, which is made with a brick vaulted ceiling. And in that space, it's kind of a place where we can take clients and talk about the work we create, noting that most of our work is residential work, and how, everyday materials can be used in special ways. And the nuance or the mood of the space is as important as the elements that create it. So it's a little bit about that last project's a little bit exposing the content and the process together as one. And lastly, I'd just like to talk about Indigo Slam as the house gallery, and it's probably our most famous project, which is for Judith Nielsen and is her personal house. And so this exhibition space for her is about, it's a very personal thing. So the art that she displays is about her memories, her love pieces, and it's also used to create an ambience for the house. So I'll just sort of take you on a little bit of a tour of the house. It's located in Chippendale, which is a recently rejuvenated industrial part of Sydney CBD. And the house was designed very much as a piece of sculpture in line with these. So we engaged this language, as we call it, of peeling and folding surfaces. The house exists as a 3-story dwelling to O'Connor Street, and then a 2-story guest house and garage to Dick Street at the back. And from the street, it really is perceived as a kind of strong, confident sculptural house. It's very much aligned to her personality in not becoming the kind of quiet person sitting on the sideline. She's confident in her love of art and wants to express that. But the form also is used to do all the things a house needs to do. It has to provide privacy, views out, ways of bringing lights in, undercover outdoor areas, and so forth. And so going through the house, you walk through a big Corten steel gate, through a 3-story high portico, up a few stairs, and come into a very beautiful foyer space with the ceilings are about 3.5 meters high. And then come into this extraordinary space, which is a staircase on the south side of the building. And you can see very limited pieces of art. And although it was designed for the art to be changed and to have many pieces of art, like a gallery, Judith felt at the end that the right thing was to do is just to put a few pieces into the space. So you can see through here, the staircase takes you up to the top floor where there's private dining and lounge. And off the right of this image, you go into the big dining hall, which seats 60 people in this case. And at the end of that room, there's a significant Russian painting, and that it was the focus of the room, in addition to small sculptural pieces. At the end of this stair hall, there was a major Chinese piece that Judith bought and wanted to house at the bottom of the stairs. And I was really tying that into the architecture and celebrating that at the bottom. And at the top of the stairs through here, you can see a small painting that looks like a traditional Chinese landscape, but is made from about 1 million nails. And this is framed in a way that takes it back to the house. So in this particular house, all of the artworks are bolted to the walls and all of the frames are custom designed, each of them different for each situation within the house. And so as you walk through all of the spaces, you see important artworks that she loves from all around the world that harmonize with the architecture itself, which is very sculptural. And you could almost say works as an artwork in its own right, designed to play with light and to play with feelings of gravity and to reflect light in very special ways. So take me back to the book. The kinds of things I've tried to really focus on in this book is an idea of the gallery and what the ideas are and people's views are on whether it has a unique spatial quality or it's better served as a white box. To talk about concepts of openness and transparency, to look at ways where you can expose the process as well as the content. So that is how you make exhibitions as well as what you exhibit. And to look at exposing items like refitting the galleries or open storage or starting to really elevate the educational experience within galleries. And then to talk a bit about those ideas of community and gathering that Kirsten was talking about earlier. And then to explore what the financial restrictions are on doing these and what the opportunities are through there again. Which brings me to the end, Georgia, of my presentation.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that. And just as a note, Lizanne McGregor wrote a chapter about the MCA in the book, and she talks a lot about, you know, the white box and how she wanted it to be highlighted, highlighting the art. So yeah, lovely that you touched on that. So we have just a few minutes. And I just wanted to see if anyone in the audience has any questions. And so if anyone has any questions, please just put it in the Q&A box or the chat, and I'll try to watch both of them. And while people are thinking through any questions they have, I wanted to begin just sort of where we started off when we were chatting here with both of you. It's been quite a year. This book came out. I mean, you all wrote your chapters, a year and a half or almost 2 years ago now, probably. But then the book came out right as COVID shut down Australia. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on how design for museums, galleries, art spaces, community spaces, how do you think it's going to shift in these post-COVID times? And I know, please don't feel like you have to have a completely prepared full paragraph, but I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on this as we all sort of navigate these new waters.
Kirsten, do you want to go?
Kirsten, you're still on mute. Yeah.
Look, I think if anything, it's made us more aware of just how important these sorts of collective spaces are, and especially when, on the one hand, there's lots of threats to public space, to sort of genuinely public things, and so it makes us have to rethink what do we mean by public, because a lot of things, and I think William's talked through this, are funded in different ways. So that's not sufficient to give these places and make them easy for everybody to access. But I think in many ways I see the architect's role as through design, and also the advocacy that is part of getting projects off the ground and getting them delivered. It is about advocating for the importance of these things and giving them their rightful place through the actual hardware of built form. So I think that is something that is an exciting part of really what architecture is able to contribute to this, to really hold on to those points of interchange, to set them up, to create those opportunities through space, landscape inside and outside, because it's just so important to have those spaces as community places for now, but also as repositories of our history and our yeah. And we haven't had that, so.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I think I went to see a performance of Sydney Dance 2 nights ago, and it's probably the first show I've been to for a while. It was just great, actually, to stand in a queue, to sit down, I just forgot about this, the feeling of the sound under the chair. The smell of, they put the smoke machine on, there was that smell. And I feel like that's probably what I've kind of come out of this thinking about, is that plus those little incidental unplanned things, because I feel like the online engagement with galleries and museums is very targeted. You're there to find a piece of information, you're there to get it, and once you've got it, then you move on. And sometimes you get a bit distracted and go off on tangents, but mostly it's kind of a fairly, it's a search and conquer and find process. And I feel like that kind of idea of just going out with a bit of loose time at the start and the end is just wonderful. So what I'd love to see happen more and more is this kind of the gallery becomes this gathering space, the magnet that pulls people together. And they might just go there to hang out as much as go and see the art. And the space is so great that that's the place you think of when you go to do that. And the relevance of that is it's not necessarily about buying something or achieving something, or, it's just about the joy of being in a beautiful space amongst, extraordinary things that make you start to feel and think and react.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a very strong memory I have of years ago visiting L'Archetton Vassale's Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and I couldn't believe how that place was just absolutely bursting at the seams at lunchtime because people just went there to hang out. It was deliberately loose and quite an unstructured space, very raw. And I think one of the things it did for me was really confound people's expectations of what gallery spaces should be like, which I think we've shown versions of that.
Mm-hmm.
White, clean space for appreciation of art. But this took a completely different approach. And I think because of that, it did attract a different demographic to what you might typically have once thought was the gallery type visitor, which I think we're now, thankfully, aware of the limits of that thinking of who is the gallery visitor. It's much wider and broader, thankfully. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned libraries as well, and I think that that's such a fascinating overlap. I miss getting to sit in a library and hearing people just moving around, and I miss going to the cafe of the neighboring museum here and just, you know, sitting and working and sort of like being out and about, but not having to be doing something, that sort of third space, even though I often take my laptop and go work there. So I am, you know, ostensibly still at work, but I, you know, and I guess it's all back open now here, but somehow I'm out of the habit, and you're reminding me that I should get back in that habit again. So thank you both. So
almost like our parks have in COVID times become where you can be with others in a way that's safe, but still, whether you want to be alone but with others or near others is so important, that possibility that these spaces also provide.
Mm-hmm. And it's part of why I think it's so important, the work that both of you are doing of sort of opening up the gallery and opening up the museum space and thinking about the exterior as well as the interior and how the interior relates to conservation, sort of easing those thresholds, easing those barriers a little bit, I think moves us toward those spaces more easily. So unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you all so much for attending. And if anyone has any questions for me, I'm going to pop my just my profile that you can find my email address on in the chat box. So you feel free to get in touch, everyone. And also I will be hosting a third panel with more authors from the book next week. And you can find information about that panel here. And it will also be recorded. So if anyone misses it, you can get in touch and I will be happy to send it to you. And finally, just to celebrate the book one last time, if you would like to purchase a copy, there's a 20% discount for people who attend this webinar. So thank you everyone so much. It has been just a pleasure. Thank you so much to William and Kirsten. It has been just a pleasure to have you both here. And unless there's any parting thoughts from either of you, we will just hit end.
Thank you, Georgia. It's really great to be part of the book and the talk tonight. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you both.
Lovely to see your work, William. Thank you for that.
Request, Kirsten.
All right. Lovely. Have good evenings, everybody.
Bye. See you.
Bye.